Hey, good morning. Welcome to our second episode of Logging On with our Division of Forestry. I'm Alyssa Yapel. Today we are going to be talking about tree ID. I have with me Kelsey. So if you could wave Kelsey, she's going to be helping me with any questions that you have today. So if you want to ask anything throughout, please use your Q&A box, folks, and we will ask our presenters either during or after the show. And then also with me, I have Brad, who is going to be presenting for us today, and Jeremy. You'll hear from them in just a minute, but I do want to let you know that what we have coming down the pike is next week we'll be talking about urban forestry and how that's a little bit different than rural forestry. And then the following week, fire prevention. Kelsey has her Smokey Bear shirt on, I see. So you guys might hear a little bit more about Smokey the last episode that we have of this Logging On webinar series. So with that, I'm going to send it to Jeremy so he can give himself an introduction, and then we will get into tree ID.
Good morning, everybody. Just to give you guys a background on what we do, Brad and I are both service foresters with the Ohio Division of Forestry, and our job is to work with private woodland owners and offer them advice on managing their forests. I'm stationed over in eastern Ohio in Guernsey County. Brad is kind of southern southwestern Ohio in Pike County, and we spend our days out in the woods working or walking around with landowners and talking about tree identification like we're going to do today, and timber management and invasive species control and all kinds of fun stuff in your woods. So today we're going to talk about tree ID.
Brad, can you share that? Oh, here it comes. Okay. And there we go. You're all good to go, Jeremy.
All right. You can go ahead and cook the slide, Brad. All right, so one of the first things to think about when we're talking about tree ID is a lot of the stuff is visual. You're looking at the tree, trying to figure out what it is, and a lot of times you're just standing there, looking at this whole tree in the woods, and we've got to break it down a little bit. Do we look at the leaves? Do we look at the bark? Do we look at the branching pattern? Do we look at the shape of the tree? Do we look at where the tree is growing? And all these things we're going to use to help identify what a tree is. But one of the first things we usually tell landowners to look at is actually the branching of the tree. And we look at the individual twig and determine whether it is an oppositely branched tree or an alternately branched tree. And you look at the two pictures at the bottom of the screen there. The one on the left is an ash, and that's an oppositely branched tree. You can see where the branches come out from the twig directly opposite of each other. The other photo is an elm tree, and you can see how they come out staggered. They're not directly across from each other. We call that alternating. So one of the ways to remember which trees fall into which category is the term mad buck. Mad buck is an acronym. It stands for maple, ash, dogwood, and buckeye. And all four of those families of trees all have oppositely branched branches. So if you walk up to that tree and you see that oppositely branched pattern, think of mad buck, maple, ash, dogwood, or buckeye. It's going to be one of those trees. So if it's not opposite and it's alternate, then it could be pretty much anything else you're going to find in the woods. It could be an oak, a hickory, a yellow-poplar, a persimmon, a beech, elm, a variety of other trees. And we don't have a lot of other ways to break those down except for the oaks. One thing the oaks all have in common, if you look at the tip of the twig where the buds are going to be on the tip, the oaks are the only species that are going to have multiple buds sitting there at the tip of that twig. Everything else is going to just have one. We call it a cluster of terminal buds, terminal meaning point. So that's another way to help break that down. So, Brad? So the next thing we look at is the identification of the tree by the leaves. So trees are either going to have a simple leaf or a compound leaf. And we seem to have lost a picture here. We're supposed to have a picture of a simple leaf, but a simple means one simple leaf all by itself. Think of a maple tree. There it comes in. Look at that. think of a maple leaf, which is the same leaf that's on the Canadian flag. It's just one leaf all by itself. And your maple, your yellow poplar, your oaks are all going to be simple leaves. But we have a whole host of other trees that have compound leaves. And compound leaves mean it has one stem or a stalk or a petiole that's made up of multiple leaflets. It could have 3, it could have 5, it could have 15 or 20 different leaflets. So the example there is a walnut, and that walnut is made up of, I'm not going to count them, but 15 or 18 leaflets all on one stem. So that whole thing is considered a leaf. Brad? So one other thing to help us distinguish between trees is monoecious versus dioecious. And this has to do with the flowering and how trees repopulate themselves or they reproduce. So some trees have separate male and female flowers, and other trees have flowers that are combined. So in instance, you either have a male and a female tree, or you have a tree that can reproduce all by itself. So that's what that talks about. All right, let's jump into the meat of this program here, and let's talk about some individual trees. So white oak, everybody knows and loves white oak. It's one of our kind of flagship trees that we have growing here in Eastern Ohio. When we're looking at an oak tree, this is going to be an alternately branched tree. It's going to have that twig with a cluster of buds at the tip of it. So that's how we break it down into the oak family. But one thing to remember about the oaks is all of your oaks are broken into 2 families, the white oak family and the red oak family. All of your white oaks have rounded leaf tips. So that tip of that leaf is going to be rounded. Your red oaks are all going to be pointed, and at the tip of that point is actually going to be a little bristle. It's going to be a little like a bristle off a paintbrush at the tip of that. So the rounded leaves are going to be in the white oak family, and the pointed leaves are going to be in the red oak family. So white oak, of course, is in the white oak family. It is a very hard wood. It gets a flaky, kind of whitish, grayish bark is pretty attractive, and it also is a great place for bats. Bats will actually climb underneath the bark and nest underneath there, get some cover and some protection. The cool thing about the acorn for the white oak is it's very sweet compared to the other acorns. And it takes 1 year to grow. So the acorn actually grows on a tree for 1 year. It'll fall off in the fall and actually germinate in the fall. The acorn will actually split open and put a radical out or a root out trying to grow in the fall, versus the red oaks that are going to grow that acorn for 2 years, and it's not going to drop to the winter and not germinate until the springtime. So one of the cool things about white oaks is the wood, the pores in the wood are clogged. So we use them for barrels that might hold whiskey or wine or even pickles, and the barrel won't leak. But if we make that same barrel out of red oak, it's going to leak and not hold any water. Brad? Bur Oak is another oak in the white oak family. If you look at the leaf there, it looks a little pointed, but it is rounded and there's no bristle tip there. This is a really cool tree, and you can see where it gets its name from the acorn. That husk on that acorn, or that cap on that acorn, has all those little burrs on it. They're not sharp, but it's pretty unique. And this tree gets huge, it gets enormous, has a huge crown spread. It grows in pretty low grade soils. And we see it a lot more in Western Ohio than we do over here in Eastern Ohio where I'm at. But it is in the white oak family, so it has a sweeter acorn that deer and other wildlife just absolutely love. And wide variety of uses for the wood, from cabinetry and furniture and trim, flooring, boat building, barrels, veneer. You name it, we can use white oak for it. So. Next one up is Chinkapin Oak. Chinkapin Oak is also in the white oak family. It does have a rounded leaf lobe. This looks a little more pointed in this photo here, but it is rounded. A nice big acorn. This usually pops up in limestone outcroppings in the woods. It likes a higher pH soil, closer to 7, which is kind of in the middle, but it's on the upper end of what our forest soils are going to be pH wise. So it's got that sweet acorn, so wildlife love it. It's used for a variety of things, including barrels, again, furniture and flooring and things like that. All trees have Latin names. That's how we can tell what species we're talking about, because common names can vary across the country. Quercus muhlenbergii is the scientific name for Chinkapin Oak, and it was named after, I want to say, Gotthilf Muhlenberg, who was a minister and botanist in the late 18th and 19th centuries. So it's really kind of interesting in some ways, somehow how some of these trees get named. Swamp white oak. Swamp white oak gets its name, honestly, because it does grow in swampy areas. It likes really wet sites. Even sometimes find it growing in almost standing water, at least for part of the year. It's also a white oak, obviously, from its name. So it's got a rounded leaf tip. The acorn on this thing is really unique. It's got that long stem on it you can see in the photo, and it's I think it's called a peduncle. That's the only oak you're going to find with that. So it's pretty unique in that regard. So again, loved by wildlife, especially water species such as ducks and birds and things like that are going to live in water areas that are wet, because they can get to those acorns a lot easier. Tree grows relatively fast. Obviously, it gets plenty of moisture, and gets nice and straight, and is pretty valuable for lumber. So we're going to switch to the red oak family. So remember the differences between the white oaks and the red oaks. And this one, the red oaks have pointed leaf tips, and you can see that bristle. And in this photo of the leaf, you can see that bristle pretty well. So that's what you want to look for. And you see the bark of these, all the white oaks we talked about so far had that kind of grayish, whitish bark. The red oaks get a lot darker and a lot rougher, and even a little harder in some cases. They don't flake off as well. Has a really big acorn, and sometimes these things can get absolutely huge. So, but remember, the red oak acorns take 2 years to produce a matured nut. So that nut's going to grow on the tree 2 growing seasons, and then it's going to fall in the winter, and then germinate in the spring. It's actually going to split that acorn open in the spring, and that's one of the big differences between white oaks and red oaks. And it's important for wildlife to think about that, because that white oak acorn, when it splits in the fall, is actually going to start deteriorating. So that acorn nut, that food source, isn't always usable all the way through the winter into the springtime, where the red oak will be. So these trees will produce a good seed crop every 2 to 5 years. So just because you don't see acorns on your tree every year isn't anything to be worried about. And it's less tolerant of shade than some of the white oaks are, and it's about equal with the black and scarlet oak. So one thing about our oaks is they like sunlight, and they need sunlight to grow. So they don't do so well in the shade. One thing about the red oaks we're dealing with currently in Ohio is a disease called oak wilt, which is pretty deadly to the trees, and it happens pretty quickly. So one thing to keep in mind is never prune your red oaks during the summertime. We want to avoid that wound, so that the fungus can't enter that tree. So red oak is used for a wide variety of uses, from cabinetry and furniture and trim and flooring and veneer. All the things that white oak is used for, except for barrels that are going to hold liquids, because they will leak. Shingle oak. This is the one that I love finding in the woods when I'm working with a landowner, because you show them the leaf and you say, what kind of tree is this? And they don't know, and they're trying to figure it out. And then you tell them it's an oak, and they look at you like you're a moron or something, because you just talked about all the oak trees having all these lobes. Well, this is the one oak tree that we find in Ohio, at least, that doesn't have, but it just has one lobe. There's not all the teeth on it, you see. But to the very tip of that leaf is a bristle tip, which means it falls into the red oak family. So I seem to find this tree either in wet areas near streams or on dry ridge tops, and it's kind of weird like that. The one advantage it does have is it does have a small acorn that a lot of birds can swallow whole. Typically your birds aren't going to chew an acorn up like a squirrel would, so they need to be able to swallow that nut whole, so it can get in their crop, and their crop can grind it up, and they can use the food out of it. So these have a nice, really small acorn that they can use that way. And it is a pretty cool tree. Usually it's covered in lower branches, which are knots, which means the lumber isn't always good quality. But it certainly has a place in our woods that needs to be there. Black oak. So this is actually one of my favorite trees. I don't know why, but it just is a beautiful tree, and I love the bark on it. The red oak that we just looked at kind of had vertical gray streaks running down it. We sometimes call them ski trails because they look like ski slope trails coming down a mountainside. But the black oak bark, it's a lot darker and doesn't have those smooth gray patches. And to me, it looks a little bit more like maybe the back of an alligator. And these trees just get beautiful, and they are in the red oak family. They do have pointed leaf tips with a bristle at the end of the leaf tips. And they sometimes get a huge leaf. Seems like when they grow in the shade, they just get this massive leaf. It's really cool. And it is actually one of the trees that will grow just about anywhere. And as listed in here, we can use it for a gauge of site index, and that helps us determine the productivity of a soil and how well trees are going to grow on that site. And we can use black oak as a gauge for that for other species. So this tree is a little bit shorter lived than some of the other ones. You know, our white oaks can grow 400 years easily at times. I typically see white oaks going downhill at about 100 years in quality, and you know, they seldom last longer than 200 years in the woods. So pin oak is probably one of our other oak trees that is lesser quality from a timber standpoint. It holds on to its lower branches, but you see this tree planted a lot in yards and parks and things like that. It tolerates a real wide range of conditions. It's historically thought of as a wet site tree, but it also grows real well in compacted areas. And a lot of our parks and yards and things like that, where we've built buildings and stuff, the soil gets compacted. And wet soils and compacted soils have a similarity in that there's a lack of pore space and a lack of oxygen in the soil. So sometimes trees that grow real well in wet sites can grow real well in harsh sites. And pin oak kind of fits that mold there. So it is a red oak. It's got a pointed leaf tip. It's got a bristle tip, but it has a very deep sinus, and the sinus is the indented portion of the leaf where the you know, that kind of U-shaped area comes down to the center leaf vein. We call that the sinus. And a lot of times on pin oak, they come almost all the way down to that center vein. And one thing you can tell when you look up into a tree, into the canopy of a pin oak, is there's a lot of sunlight that comes through it because there's not a lot of surface area for that leaf. So that's one thing that we can look at to help with identification of it. Again, it has a small acorn like some of the others we talked about, so wood ducks and other ducks and other wet site loving animals can swallow that acorn whole, excuse me, without having to chew it up. Brad? And yellow poplar. So I've always been a stickler about this, and it was probably something that was ingrained in me in college, but I always try to make sure that the hyphen is in the name of yellow poplar. And what that hyphen indicates is that it's not a true poplar. This tree is actually in the magnolia family, but its common name was given poplar years ago because it looked like some trees that are in the poplar family. But this is a really cool tree. It is probably one of the tallest and straightest and sometimes largest trees that you're going to find in the woods. These things just grow like telephone poles, but huge telephone poles. And it's not uncommon to see one that's 120 feet tall in the woods. They're really cool in that regard. The wood is pretty soft. It gets kind of a yellowish color, hence the name yellow in its name. But it's also commonly called tulip tree, and that's what a lot of people call it. And then sometimes they combine the two names and call it tulip poplar. It has a really beautiful flower on it. Most of the time it points up, so you don't see it from the ground. But if you can get in the springtime a branch near the ground and see the flower, it's got this big flower almost the size of my hand that's yellow and white, and honeybees and other pollinators absolutely love it in that time of year. So it's a very long-lived growing tree as well, and just a cool tree. And this is where Brad's going to get to take over. So you guys are probably tired of hearing from me at this point.
Sending you live now. There you go. I think I muted.
Okay, am I on?
Yep.
Okay. Hey everybody, just to let you know my background, tree ID, it can seem overwhelming, but I'm a farm boy from Northwest Ohio, and I grew up in ag and livestock land, and that's where I did a lot of my work growing up. And if I can learn these trees, anybody can. And one of the cool things I like to do is I've got an 8-year-old son, and gathering firewood, teach him how to ID the bark on trees when we're out gathering firewood. And leaves are a luxury that only exists for about half the year. And so to identify a tree properly by its bark and its branching structure, whether it's like what Jeremy said earlier in the presentation, alternate or opposite, and then what the buds look like, are important traits of each tree, and how we as foresters identify trees and how you can identify trees too. So the first tree to kind of start off in this on my half is sugar maple. And it's also called hard maple in the industry, forest industry. It's called hard maple because the fiber structure is stronger than other maple species. And also, you know, it's a tree around here. It can grow around all of Ohio, and it's the primary tree that people tap into the late winter period to get sap to boil down to make what a lot of us like to pour over our pancakes in the morning, that good maple syrup. And the reason why sometimes you go to the store and you think, man, maple syrup costs a lot of money. Well, there's a reason why, because it takes a lot of sap to boil down to get to that really, really good sweet syrup. So it takes almost 40 gallons of sap to get 1 gallon of syrup. Now that's a lot of sap. I don't mean to be sappy here. Anyway, we have other species, as you can see on the upper part of this younger stem. You can almost see these horizontal lines into that tree. And we have a woodpecker species here in Ohio. It's called the sapsucker. Now this woodpecker is interesting, and the fact that it does prefer out in the woods a lot of times the maple or hickory species. And so you can usually see these horizontal lines in maple trees out in the woods, and that's kind of how I like to teach how to identify some maple or hickory compared to other species in the woods, because sapsuckers usually tend to favor these two species of trees. And as you can see on the smaller stem, on this sugar maple, you can see those horizontal lines, and that's kind of what that is those are old scarred over areas from where the sapsucker was actually drilling into the tree, and they use their beaks to tap into that tree. They will eat the sap, but the sap also attracts insects, which they also feed on. So those are smart little creatures that do that work in the woods. And I always thought that was an interesting trait. Also, that sap that the tree exudes, it also can develop this fungus. This fungus can develop on that sap on the bark and create these like dark stained areas on the tree. And some people may misconstrue that for having a bad disease in which that tree is going to die, but that is actually where the sap is drained from some of those old sapsucker lines. Also, that where the woodpeckers, where those sapsuckers core into those trees, it also creates a vector that is defined as bird peck in the lumber market on this sugar maple or hard maple lumber.
And what some people will classify as a defect, I classify as a cool characteristic trait of that lumber. I think it makes really neat lumber. It's really interesting to see that. And also sugar maple, when we're talking about growing sugar maple, it does grow on a wide range of sites, but it grows best on the well-drained, loamy soils. So that's where you're going to see the best sugar maple trees, the best sugar maple growth. Also, in the years since the emerald ash borer has negatively impacted a lot of our ash trees, you also have businesses that are looking for alternative ways and alternative trees to use to be able to make their products, such as Louisville Slugger. So the maker of baseball bats. And so I actually own a Louisville Slugger bat that's made out of sugar maple or hard maple. It's a really good way that Louisville Slugger has diversified what kind of species they bring into the mix and making their baseball bats. That way they can continue to make baseball bats, because I like playing baseball and I like watching baseball, and I know a lot of you guys out there do too. So that's very important. Also, in addition to those things and those attributes of sugar maple trees, it's used in furniture, from flooring to cabinetry, to gun stocks, tool handles, cutting blocks, basketball court floors. Okay, I like to shoot hoops just like anybody else, and the basketball court floors are an important part of watching that game and watching those players out there making their best game possible. Also, bowling pins and musical instruments. So, such as guitars, I have a backing of one of my guitars that has sugar maple or hard maple on it, which is pretty neat. And the other maple species is red maple, also called soft maple. So the maple species, you have two main species that are in the lumber market are referred to as hard maple or soft maple. The next maple species that I'm going to talk about are soft maple, where the lumber and the fiber in the lumber is a little bit more brittle than that of the hard maple. And red maple is one of the most abundant and widespread trees in all of Eastern North America. And which also means this can create a challenge to grow other species, like what Jeremy was talking about earlier in the presentation, species such as white oak. And that's where this species is impacting in a negative way the growth and development of white oak acorns and restricting their development in the woods. So this is an attributing factor to a challenging germination, growth, and development of white oak as well. But red maple definitely also has its place too, and that it can thrive in a wider range of soil types and sites than about any other forest species in North America as well. So maybe somewhere where you think there's not a tree that can be planted, or anything where a site where a tree could grow, then maybe you'll have luck with red maple. So there are definitely good situations, circumstances, and sites for red maple growth and development. And red maple can also be somewhat of a valuable lumber at times too. Now, market trends tend to see that the maple market, and particularly the soft maple market, fluctuates the most of about any other lumber market out there, because there's just different fluctuations in the demand for the red maple or soft maple products. And red maple can also be tapped for maple syrup, but the sap itself has a lower sugar content, which means you're going to have to boil a lot more sap to get your maple syrup. One of the traits of this tree is it is so diverse in how the bark looks on this tree, from its younger age to its more mature age. The bark can look totally different. However, if you look at and pay attention to these traits, like on the upper right of the screen, you see where there were some old limbs or where there's knots in the tree, and how there's almost these dark areas around where the notches are, where those knots are in the tree. And I like to call that smooth bark with scar patches. So if you look up at the tree, even as you look at the tree in its more mature stage, you will still see the upper limbs exhibiting that smooth bark with those scar patches on it. So that's a way that you can identify red maple out in the woods compared to sugar maple. Also, on the red maple, I like to tell people a way to identify a red maple from a sugar maple leaf is a red maple has a rough edge or a serrated edge, whereas a sugar maple has a smooth edge. And so by looking at the leaf and seeing that it has that serrated edge, then you can say, okay, that's definitely not sugar maple, and you can narrow it down to being a soft maple species. And these are the seeds or the samara for the red maple trees. So a lot of these trees that I'm going to talk about are what we call soft mast. And a lot of the trees that Jeremy talked about earlier are called hard mast. So a lot of the hard mast species are eaten by a lot of mammals, whether it's, deer, turkey, there's, abundance of squirrels, and in some bird species like, for example, blue jays. And then and then on these soft mast species is things that a lot of birds can consume. Like what Jeremy was saying, it's hard for a lot of the bird species to be able to adequately consume these hard mast species like a hickory nut or a big acorn from, like, let's say, the northern red oak trees. So birds will, a lot of the birds will tend to go after these soft mast species. So that's what this is this is an example of a soft mast species, this red maple. And the next tree is silver maple. So, and a lot of trees that are in yards across Ohio have this species of tree, okay? And there's a reason why. This is a very rapid growing tree, and it's easy to get established in a lot of sites. But in the woods and in the forest, we commonly find this growing along the bottomland areas, along streams and floodplains. So this is a bottomland, what we call a bottomland tree species. And this is also referred to as soft maple, water maple, swamp maple. And it is the first of the maple species to bloom in the spring. So also you can also see that with getting into, the going in from the late winter into the early spring, you can start really seeing the bud swell on this. And what I refer to as bud swell is, so the leaf buds, once the temperature and the conditions get right, that leaf bud starts to expand and allow what we call that leaf to break bud. So that leaf will actually emerge from that bud of that twig. And the buds, they are an important link in the food chain of squirrel populations. So the early bud swelling and bud break characteristics of this species come during the critical late winter, early springtime, when basically a lot of the food storage has kind of diminished. And so it leaves the squirrels and some of the other life, some of the other wildlife squandering, trying to figure out other food sources. So this is critical for that. And also, it ranks as a high food source for beavers in Southeast Ohio. And the other one is Boxelder. So Boxelder is in the maple family, and it has an opposite branching pattern. Other names for this tree are ashleaf maple and boxelder maple. But this one is also a bottomland tree species. So it grows along streams, floodplains, low-lying areas. This tree, it's usually not much for a timber tree just because of its growth characteristics. Not be a very straight tree. And this is one of the only end twigs in Ohio too that has a green end twig on it. So if you're in a low-lying area, if you're along a stream and it's the winter time and you see a tree out there, but you're not really sure what it is, it's got opposite branching pattern, and you look at the end twig and you'll see that it has this green end twig, and that's one of the main identifying characteristics in the wintertime of a boxelder tree. So always keep that in mind. Also, this is the most widely distributed of all maples, ranging from Canada to Guatemala. That is a pretty sizable range of a tree to grow. And then the next one on the list, we have ash. So in this, you have, it's currently facing a major problem. And in forestry, in the forestry realm, things really happen in long frames of time compared to some other things that we have in our natural world. So I know that the emerald ash borer has been around for a while, which is this little tiny insect, but it is still a new problem in the realm of forestry. And so the ash, like what Jeremy was saying, has an opposite branching pattern. So you'll have limbs that are directly opposite of one another, or you'll have the leaf buds too that are directly opposite of each other. And this is the compound leaf. So in this leaf stalk, you have a, multitude of leaves in it, okay? And then with the ash bark, you can actually see what a true emerald ash borer hole is. So what happens is the adult emerald ash borer insects feed on the foliage. The females are the ones that lay the eggs, and the eggs, they then pupate or turn into larvae, and the larvae are what do the damage. They feed on that living tissue, that sapwood of the ash trees. And in heavy populations of them, of these larvae, it basically cuts off that nutrient flow to that tree, causing tree death. But the emergence hole is what you see on the bottom right of your screen, which is where that emerald ash borer insect, the larvae has pupated into its adult stage of that flying insect. So it chews its way out, and that's actually the shape of its head as it emerges from that sapwood and inner bark. So that's the size of the actual emerald ash borer hole. There's a lot of questions from people a lot of times, understandably so, about is this an emerald ash borer hole or is this not? So to give you a true scale of the size of the emerald ash borer hole, I kind of took a picture of that and held up the edge of my pen so you can see the actual size of it. They're not very big at all. Such little insects cause such major devastation. Also, we have hickory trees. So there's different species of hickory we have in Ohio here. We have shellbark, shagbark, pignut, mockernut hickory, just to name a few. Bitternut hickory trees also are on the typically like the lower slopes areas, mid to lower slope areas in the forest. And they can also be in some bottomland areas too. But shagbark hickory, one of the most commonly found hickory species, takes about 40 years to start producing seeds, or those hickory nuts. Good seed crops occur at an interval of every 1 to 3 years. And sometimes there may not be very many hickory nuts. And other times, in the intermittent years, you may not see any hickory nuts at all. That does not necessarily mean that there's any health issue with that individual hickory tree. It just means that might just be one of those interval years amongst the years where it can produce a lot of seed. And it's among one of the hardest and strongest wood species native to the USA. And it's a very dense wood. Anybody that's ever done any woodworking knows just how dense hickory lumber is. And because it's so dense, its common uses are for tool handles, ladder rungs, wheel spokes, and flooring. And the branching structure on the hickory is alternate. So it's a staggered branching structure on it. You won't have on a given limb, you won't have two twigs right across from each other. And the example of the hickory tree in this slideshow, this is what we call a pig nut hickory. So this is a pretty common tree species found in southern Ohio, where I'm at. And that's the leaf of the pig nut hickory there on the left there where you see the leaf. And the shagbark hickory nuts are what you see as far as the fruits of the hickory tree goes, are what's exhibited on this slide. And again, this is what we would refer to as a hard mast producing tree species. And next one we have on the list is black cherry. And this also grows on a wide variety of soils. It's got a fast growth rate, and the lifespan is, in terms of tree species, is relatively short. It's about 100 years. And it's known in the woodworking arena as one of the best all-around wood species for workability. And some of the common uses include cabinetry, flooring, fine furniture, turn objects. And with the current trends in the housing construction, things like that, we don't see a whole lot of cherry for cabinets anymore, but I think it still makes a beautiful wood and beautiful lumber for different kinds of designs and purposes. Also, an important thing to consider with black cherry is that when these leaves experience wilt, they can contain cyanide, and they can potentially become lethal for livestock. And then I put this little fact in here: for a 1,200-pound cow, consuming just over a pound of wilted leaves may constitute a lethal dose, which is very interesting. I work in a lot of agricultural and mixed farm woodland in my area. So the people that I work with have livestock. And so this is one of the things, if someone has cherry trees that are starting to grow on a fence line or anything like that, I warn them about the potential hazards of cherries along the edges of pastures, because that can be a very toxic environment for the livestock. The next tree on the list is black walnut, and this is also a hard mast tree species that produces a hard mast. And it's one of the most coveted of the native hardwoods. And you can also see that in the lumber market, how it currently is. It's one of the most valuable species out there in the lumber market. And this has a compound leaf structure on it. So again, you have a leaf stalk composed of a multitude of leaves. And this grows best on the deep, well-drained soils that are often found at elevated floodplains on the lower north or east-facing slopes. And the lumber is also very valued for fine furniture and gun stocks. And this tree is monoecious, so it has both male and female reproductive organs on an individual tree. And so what also that means is, yes, there are a black walnut tree by itself will have those black walnuts, will have that hard mast on it. And then good seed crops with a lot of our native trees seem to be slightly irregular. Maybe a couple times in 5 years, you'll have an abundant, really good seed crop in black walnuts. The other important fact is they're very intolerant of shade. So selective cutting in woodlands significantly reduces the black walnut component. And this is a problem for maintaining black walnut in woodland, because usually you'll see black walnut coexist with other species that may not be as valuable, such as Boxelder, bitternut hickory, and some other lower grade species, sycamore. So that's why harvesting in the right way can sustain different species of trees. And that's one of the things I do as a service forester, is I help woodland owners out to identify their trees. And it's important to know your trees, because that way you can have the best woods for your future. And if you're an adult watching the show, your children's future. And now I found this interesting fact. So that the ground walnut shell products, they're used to clean jet engines. Isn't that cool? Like, you have the ground shell of a walnut cleans our jet engines. So like the next time I see a Boeing, I think, man, I think, black walnut help that engine go, So I think that's kind of cool, and it's also used as additives to drilling mud for oil drilling operations, as filler and dynamite, a non-slip agent in automobile tires, as air pressure propellant to strip paints. So if anybody has ever heard of the term sandblasting, to get rid of an existing paint layer, that's kind of what that talks about. And also as a filter agent in scrubbers for smokestacks, and as a powder-like carrying agent in various insecticides. Talk about the uses that we have for a ground walnut shell. It's amazing to me. The next thing we're going to talk about, the next tree we're going to talk about, is American beech. So, and this tree species can be found throughout much of eastern United States, and it's slow growing. This thing can survive in the understory. It's very shade tolerant, and it can live for up to 400 years. Man, isn't that crazy? The wood is excellent for turning and steam bending. Beech wood wears well, and it's easily treated by preservatives like linseed oil, things like that, to help preserve the wood and not dry it out. And this tree is also monoecious, which means that there's both male and female reproductive parts of the tree. So an individual tree can produce its own beech nut and its own seed, which you see on the bottom of the screen there. That the nut has this little husk. It's a spiny husk around this, and the seed starts to fall after the first heavy frost that caused the burrs to open. And the wood's used for a variety of things. You guys can read there on the screen. And I also have this old Scribner logbook that I inherited from my father that was dated circa early 1900s. And there it's rumored that beech leaves were used in the bedding and logging and outdoorsmen's camps in the early 19th and early 20th centuries, because the vermin, like mice, it detracted those leaves kind of detracted them. And also a major, huge factor that we're having, and it's getting a lot of exhibiting signs of in northeastern Ohio, is beech leaf disease, which affects the leaves, and it negatively impacts that tree. That plant can't photosynthesize or absorb the sun's energy that it needs to survive. And and people in northeast Ohio are experiencing a lot of beech trees that are dying because of this beech leaf disease. And another one that is a really cool tree in Ohio is persimmon. The persimmon tree, it grows in a very wide range of conditions, from very dry, sterile lands to sandy woodlands, river bottoms, really fertile areas along streams, things like that. And it exists here in southern Ohio, where I'm at. And it's dioecious, so there's male and female trees. And this is very tolerant of shade. However, it can do well in the open as well, but it it can do also extremely well in a somewhat shaded environment, and it can persist in the understory of a forest for many years, which is kind of cool to think about. And due to its hardness, smoothness, even texture, it's desirability for plain stalks. And now what you're thinking of for plain stalks is in the early, kind of like the early 20th century, we had a lot of woodworkers, a lot of craftsmen that would hand planing tools that the wood is actually used for. Golf club heads too. So I have some wooden golf club heads that I own that were made from persimmon, which is really cool to think about. And the dried fruit can be fermented with hops, cornmeal, or wheat bran into a sort of beer, which that's also a very cool thing. And the dried, roasted, and ground seeds have been used as a substitute for coffee. I didn't know that. Now, me and my son like to go out in the fall. The interesting thing about this fruit, usually the fruit will be fully ripened after the first couple of hard frosts that we have here in the fall. And that's when we like to go on the hunt for these persimmon fruits, because it is one of the only like soft kind of gelatinous fruits of our native trees here in Ohio. And it's also heavily prized by our wildlife that we have here, such as deer. You know, we call these in Southern Ohio, we call the persimmon fruits deer candy. You know, it's so cool. These trees are have such cool features about them. So, and also one of the important things to touch on is we've talked about the good. Now we got to talk about the bad, the invasive plants, the ones that are starting to take over some areas of our woodlands here in Ohio. And one of those tree species is the ailanthus tree, or a lot of people call it the tree of heaven. But it's also, this tree has a very pungent odor when you're around it. Some people refer to it as like stink tree or skunk tree. And also, this tree can be confused with a black walnut. Now, it's important to know what the leaf structure looks like on the ailanthus tree compared to a black walnut. So on a black walnut tree, the leaf edge will have that serrated edge, whereas an ailanthus tree has a smooth edge, and it has two lobes at the base of the leaf. So remember, if you see this tree and it looks like a walnut leaf, look closely and find out if it has a smooth edge or a serrated edge. And that will give you the key to identifying if this is a good or a bad tree. Also, the ailanthus bark, you can see on that it's a very distinctive bark on that tree. And we as service foresters help landowners to figure out if they can maximize the productivity in their woodlands by finding these invasive plants and getting them under control. We can't totally eradicate the population, but the idea is if we can control these bad boys, then we can be able to get the good stuff to grow. Also, some of the other invasive plants we have here in Ohio we have shrubs, these invasive shrubs. The problem is not with the big trees, but with what's going on in the ground, okay? So in order to germinate seeds, light has to absorb to the forest floor, and also nutrients have to get absorbed in the soil. So these seeds, once they start to root, they can grow. Well, the problem is these invasive shrubs, they're getting so prolific, or there's so many of them, that they take away the opportunity from our native trees to germinate those seeds to germinate well. And for example, we have some shrubs here. We have bush honeysuckle, that's the leaf, that's what it looks like. And we have the autumn olive shrub, and that's what the leaf looks like. And on a windy day, as you're driving down the highway and you see some of these shrubs blowing when they still have the leaves on, the autumn olive, I always tell people, looks like somebody took some like aluminum spray paint and spray painted the underside of that leaf with aluminum paint. They're so shiny, it's hard to miss them. And also we have some other shrubs too that are bad. We have Japanese barberry, and I think what a lot of us know is multiflora rose, okay? So those are also bad ones that can be disruptive to our native ecosystems and environments. And here are some references that you can use to help further your information and knowledge about tree identification. And I think we are out of time.
We are almost out of time. I'm hearing an echo, so I'm gonna maybe mute you for a second, Brad.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. So just a couple of questions I actually was going to ask you about tree IDs that you tree ID guides that you'd recommend, but you got to it before I could ask you. And how do you identify a sapling? Jeremy or Brad, would one of you want to take that?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, as far as identifying saplings, that's where we use the traits of the twig and bud identification, especially in wintertime. So that's what we typically will do. And a sapling will still have that branching pattern of either opposite or alternate. That's the main thing, is to figure out, is this tree's branching structure opposite or alternate? And then that's when you can start to break down, especially in the wintertime, what species it is. And then you can look at the leaf buds to figure out what it could be. So if you have a cluster of buds on a sapling that is alternately branched, or that has on a given limb staggered twigs throughout the length of that limb, and on the end of that twig you have a cluster of buds, then you can determine that that is an oak sapling.
Okay, and just a fun question to end on. We'll start with you, Brad, and then hand it to Jeremy. What's your favorite tree?
Being from Western Ohio, my favorite tree is a Bur Oak, because I remember growing up and seeing those in the fields and just seeing how big and majestic those trees can really get. And I just thought about all the decades or centuries that those trees lived and all the stories they had to tell, from all the different ways of settlement to, to everything that's happened, climate-wise, and everything. I thought they were a very interesting tree, and they're still one of my favorite trees to this day.
Awesome, thank you. And then Jeremy?
Yeah, so I mean, I talked about one of my favorite trees earlier, black oak, but if I was going to pick my favorite tree, it's actually a tree we didn't talk about today called butternut. Butternut's also known as white walnut, so it is in the walnut family, and it's a sister to the black walnut. And as its name, the wood isn't white, but it's much lighter in color. It's soft. It's just not a common tree. It was never real common in Ohio. You walk into woods and you find a whole grove of walnut trees, or maybe a few hundred walnut trees. You would find 2 or 3 butternut trees. You might be lucky to find 10 butternut trees on a property. And they are getting hit with a disease called butternut decline that is making them a little more scarce, and they're not endangered yet, but they're certainly on the kind of the watch list. But one of the cool things about them is the nut. It's similar to a walnut, but instead of being round, it's oval or oblong, and it's real sticky. And the nut in it is real soft, hence the name. It's kind of buttery, hence the name butternut. So just a really cool tree. But if you're a forester, you're kind of a geek with trees and you think they're all cool too. So.
Well, thank you, Jeremy and Brad and Kelsey, for joining us today and helping out. I just want to remind you, next week we're talking about urban forestry. So same time, same place, Tuesdays at 10. And if you think that you need to, now I think Jeremy mentioned earlier before we got started that he can see 40 miles from his porch. If you think you need to be out in the country to, find a forest, you don't actually need to. You can find them closer than you think, or you can study forestry closer than you think. So we're going to learn about urban forestry. And then the following week, like I said, fire prevention. We're getting close to burn season or wildfire prevention. We're getting close to burn season, so we're going to hear from a couple of our foresters 2 Tuesdays from now, once again at 10. So thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Bye.